September 26, 1983, just after midnight. Moscow, Russia. Inside a heavily guarded bunker, alarms begin to scream, and panic spreads through the room. On a glowing screen, a single word appears in bold red: launch. The system insists that an American nuclear missile has been fired, a weapon powerful enough to erase an entire city, and it's heading straight toward the Soviet Union. Then, another. Then another. Within seconds, the computer shows 5 incoming missiles rising from US soil. With only 15 minutes left before impact, the room freezes. Every man in uniform knows what this means. If true, it is the beginning of World War III. But in that room, one officer is in charge. His name, Stanislav Petrov, 44 years old, a lieutenant colonel, calm, analytical, and suddenly the most important man alive. Because in the next minutes, one decision from Petrov could determine whether hundreds of millions of people live or die. To understand this night, we have to step back. Back into the strange, paranoid world of the Cold War. For nearly 40 years, 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stared each other down with thousands of nuclear weapons. Each side believed the other might strike first. Each side trained to launch at a moment's notice. By the early 1980s, the tension was unbearable. NATO had escalated military drills in Europe. President Ronald Reagan had branded the Soviet Union an evil empire. And just weeks earlier, a Soviet fighter jet had shot down a civilian airliner, Korean Air Flight 007, killing all 269 people aboard, including a US congressman. Washington was outraged. Moscow was terrified. The atmosphere inside the Kremlin was electric with fear. The Soviet leadership believed the Americans were preparing for a decapitation strike, one that could destroy command centers in Moscow before the Soviets had time to react. So they built a new early warning system. It was called OKO, the Russian word for eye. A constellation of satellites high above the Earth designed to spot American missile launches the instant they happened. And on the night of September 26, 1983, Stanislav Petrov sat in front of those very monitors. It was his duty to watch, to interpret, and above all, to follow protocol. The rules were brutally simple. If the system reported launches, he had to verify. If verified, he was required to pick up the phone to Moscow. And if he confirmed yes, missiles are on their way, the chain of command would immediately order a full retaliatory strike. Thousands of Soviet missiles would roar from their silos. American warheads would respond, and in less than an hour, the planet would be on fire. Petrov knew this. Every officer in that room knew it. That was the system. Cold, mechanical, absolute. And now, in the quiet hours after midnight, the system was screaming at him. Missiles inbound, 5 of them. No time for hesitation. Yet Petrov hesitated, because something felt wrong. The alarm still echoed through the bunker. Red lights flashed above the consoles. Petrov stared at the glowing screen in front of him. 1 missile, then 2, then 3. The system was clear. 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles were rising from their silos. Protocol left no room for doubt. If confirmed, he had to pick up the phone. He had to report that the United States had launched a nuclear first strike. That single report would climb the chain of command to the highest generals, and then to the Politburo itself. And from there, the orders would be unstoppable. A full retaliatory launch. Thousands of warheads unleashed toward the United States, Europe, and Allied bases worldwide. Petrov's finger hovered above the phone. His mind raced. The system was brand new, just months old. Could it already be failing? He tried to reason it through. Why would America fire only 5 missiles? If the US wanted to cripple the Soviet Union, it would launch hundreds, thousands, not just 5. Still, 5 missiles were enough to devastate Moscow. 5 missiles could erase the Soviet command centers, leaving the country blind. Maybe this was a decapitation strike, the very kind Soviet intelligence had warned about. The minutes ticked by. Each second felt like an eternity. Other officers in the room looked at him, waiting. Their training told them, trust the system. Machines do not lie. But Petrov had doubts. Machines can lie. Machines can fail. And in the back of his mind, he knew something else. If he was wrong, he would be responsible for the destruction of his entire country. If he was right and did nothing, and the missiles were real, then the Soviet Union and millions of lives would vanish in silence. Either way, millions would die. He glanced down at the massive red phone, the hotline to the general staff. One word from him, confirmed, would light the fuse. Petrov wiped sweat from his brow. His hand trembled slightly. He forced himself to think like an American general. Would the United States really gamble everything on a small salvo of 5 missiles? Number? It made no sense. He looked again at the screen. Missiles tracked, trajectory lines glowing across the map. But where was the backup confirmation? Ground radar should be picking up the incoming warheads by now. Yet radar showed nothing, only the satellites were reporting launches. And those satellites, he remembered, had a critical weakness. Oko was designed to detect the heat of rocket engines against the darkness of space. But under certain conditions, at just the wrong angle, sunlight reflected off high-altitude clouds could fool the sensors. Could this be that moment? The room around him was tense, electric. Men shifting in their seats, eyes darting to Petrov. Some whispered, "It's real. We must respond." Others stayed silent, paralyzed. Petrov was the decision point. The weight pressed down on him like the ceiling itself was collapsing. He remembered his training. He remembered the manuals, the strict instructions, trust the system. But he also remembered his instinct, his logic. The pattern didn't add up. He thought about his wife, asleep at home, about his children, and about the millions of ordinary people in Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, all unaware that their fate was being decided in this one bunker. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed sharp. He wrote in his logbook, slowly, deliberately, launch alarm received. Satellite system reports 5 missiles. Ground radar silent. Probability of error high. Then he made his choice. He would not call it in. He would not confirm an attack. He picked up the phone and told his superiors that the system was malfunctioning, that no missiles were on their way. The room was silent. Every officer held his breath. If Petrov was wrong, in just minutes, they would hear the thunder of nuclear detonations across the horizon. The Soviet Union would be gone. They waited. 5 minutes passed, 10, 15. No explosions. No missiles. Nothing. The screens eventually went dark. The warning vanished. The Earth was still intact. Only then did the men in the bunker allow themselves to breathe. Later, investigators discovered the truth. That night, the Oko satellites had been blinded by a rare alignment of the sun, Earth, and high clouds over the United States. The sunlight reflected directly into the sensors, tricking them into reading rocket launches where none existed. It was a glitch, a false alarm, one of the most dangerous in human history. And if not for Petrov's hesitation, his logic, and his refusal to obey blindly, that glitch might have triggered the end of civilization. When the crisis ended, the room emptied in silence. There were no cheers, no congratulations, just the quiet sound of papers being stacked, chairs pushed back, men walking out with pale faces. Stanislav Petrov sat alone at his console, exhausted, drained, still replaying the decision in his head. He knew he had taken a gamble. If the missiles had been real, history would remember him as the man who allowed the Soviet Union to be destroyed. If they were not real, then perhaps, just perhaps, he had prevented the greatest catastrophe in human history. But there was no reward, no medal, no handshake from generals. In fact, Petrov was reprimanded. His superiors accused him of not filling out his logbook correctly during the incident. Officially, the event was classified. No one outside that bunker was supposed to know it had even happened. For years, Petrov lived in obscurity. He retired from the military not long after. He returned to his small apartment outside Moscow. He cared for his wife, who would later pass away from cancer. And he lived on a modest pension. It was not until the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the truth began to emerge. A Russian general speaking at a conference casually mentioned a near miss. Western journalists began to investigate. Slowly, the story of September 26, 1983 came to light. By then, the world had already survived another decade of nuclear tension. But historians quickly understood the scale of what Petrov had done. Some called him the man who saved the world. When asked, Petrov himself brushed it off. He insisted he was no hero. In his words, "I was just doing my job." But was he? Was this simply a man following routine? Or was it one of the greatest acts of heroism in human history? That question still divides people today. And maybe it's a question you should answer. Yet the scale of his job was unlike anything before or since. In that dark bunker, with alarms blaring, with the fate of 500 million people hanging in the balance, Petrov had chosen hesitation. He had chosen doubt. He had chosen to trust his own logic over the demands of a machine. And in that moment, one man's skepticism saved humanity from nuclear war. Think about that. Every person alive today, every city standing, every family, every child, every life may owe its existence to a single Soviet officer's refusal to follow orders. History often celebrates generals, presidents, kings. But sometimes, the true guardians of humanity are hidden figures, men and women in forgotten rooms, making decisions no one will ever see. Stanislav Petrov was one of them. In 2004, he was finally recognized by the United Nations and honored with a World Citizen Award. In 2014, a documentary was released about his story. And yet, Petrov remained modest. He never saw himself as a savior, only as a man who refused to act blindly when the world demanded it. He passed away quietly in 2017, at the age of 77. By then, his story had begun to spread. Teachers used it in classrooms, historians wrote about it in books, and millions of people learned about the night the world almost ended, but didn't, because of one man. Petrov's choice reminds us of something powerful, that sometimes survival depends not on strength or weapons or technology, but on doubt, on the courage to question what seems certain, on the refusal to press a button when the world demands it. It is strange to think that civilization itself may exist today because one officer decided to wait, because he trusted reason over fear. Stanislav Petrov's decision was not celebrated. It was buried in secrecy. But history remembers what the system tried to forget, and his story is just one of many. Moments when the world balanced on a knife's edge. Moments when ordinary men and women faced impossible choices and changed history in silence. These are the stories hidden in classified files, the stories whispered in corridors of power, the stories waiting to be unveiled. You've been watching Unveiled Ops. Subscribe and continue the journey, because the next decision, the next secret, the next revelation is already waiting to be unveiled.